another fundamental principle of politics and political science, democracy, study of democracy. And the readings you have assigned for this week, classical readings on democracy, very important to look at some of the seminal work in light of the fall of communism and the opening up of spread of liberal democracy around the world by Terry Lynn and Schmitter from 1991. If you haven't already read it, it's absolutely essential. So you have to read those in order to understand the arguments being made and the whole definition, the premise of democracy. And first, though, I want to start off a little bit looking at what we actually think of about democracy, because it's very easy when you live a sheltered life today in the United States where war takes place overseas, and unless you've been deployed overseas or have family deployed overseas, we have two oceans that have shielded us. We have friendly neighbors to the north and south. Whereas if you've lived in basically anywhere else aside from North America, well, excluding Mexico, which have experienced it recently, this whole notion of having to question whether or not you can speak up freely, what you can look up online, what you can watch on TV, what you can read in the newspapers, what you can say in public spaces, is not really a question. We have debates on what's appropriate language in public spaces, what's appropriate vernacular to use, but that boils down to things like whether it's too sexual or profanity should be used. It's not the actual substance of an argument. Whereas right now you have people being thrown in jail in Ukraine simply for expressing the disappointment with the president. You have journalists in Turkey being jailed simply because they question whether or not the country committed genocide 100 years ago. And that happens on a routinely basis. And the thing that we think of as democracy, the freedom to express what we like and what we want, we tend to take for granted. You can go out and say anything you want about me, about the president, basically anything you want about anyone, as long as you don't threaten them. Threaten to actually act in a certain way. You can act however ignorant and however stupidly and say whatever crap you want, and that's your right. But we take that for granted today in ways that most people around the world do not. And while some people in here may be offended by some of the statements up here and others may totally agree, the fact is that democracy has to hurt. You cannot live in a country with even a semblance of democracy unless you're prepared to be offended, and most people on a daily basis. If you happen to find yourself in a country where you on a daily basis are either scared out of your wits or are never offended, I can guarantee you are not in anything that we remotely call a democracy. You have to have the right to express opinions with which others agree or disagree and have a contestation of ideas. And the heart of that, and of course all of these come from what we call media, whether it be professional media or blog media or other media sites. Hallmark of that is of course what we refer to as civil society. You, me, media, non-governmental organizations, groups that you join because for some reason or another you want to change where you live or the country you live in. And that civil society is an absolute essential part of democracy. It's an essential part of a functioning system where people have a voice. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a book in the mid-19th century, 1832, 1834, already talking about one of the great hallmarks of American society, volunteerism. The fact that you actually voluntarily spend your time and money and energy and effort doing things that in many societies you expect people do professionally or get paid to do. The fact that we have volunteer firefighters in the United States is a unique feature. There are a few countries that have adopted it since, but it was a unique feature in the United States for a long time, and something that every foreign visitor came and could not for the life of them understand. Why in the world would people voluntarily? That's what taxes go to. Well, in Pennsylvania, they go to a lot of other stuff. But people find that surprising. Likewise, we would find it, many of you would find it equally surprising that in a democratic society with little corruption and a federal system like ourselves in Germany, nearly all social welfare is administered through churches and religious organizations. You decide on your taxes where your money goes, and they then distribute welfare. And for most Americans, that would be fundamentally opposite to everything that the Constitution stands for. But it works. So democracy and the contestation of ideas can take very different institutional and normative expressions. But this notion that you can live in a system without being offended is fundamentally opposite to everything that has to do with democracy, even at the most loosely defined notion. The right to be ignorant. Absolutely your right too. Regardless of what you think of the particular group to which this lady may or may not belong, the reason why I include this has nothing to do with ideology, but more to do with the fact that if you protest the size of government and that government shouldn't touch Medicare, when Medicare is what? 100% funded by government, federal and state. It sort of lends a little bit of questioning to your argument. But it's your absolute fundamental right to argue this, to protest for it, even if it's empirically 100% wrong. That's your right. Many of you may not remember, but in 2005, and I'll get to this here in a second, a Danish cartoon artist, and you need to know that in Scandinavia, in the print media, you can print things that would never be acceptable even here. There is press freedom to the point where there is nothing you can't print unless it's top national security classified and you've stolen it. Otherwise, everything is fair game. Danish cartoon artist in a newspaper had printed a bunch of cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad, with Obama on his head and displaying him as a philanderer and terrorist and so on. And that caused the Danish embassy in many places in the Middle East to be attacked, even bombed, death threats, attempts on his life. American newspapers actually refrained from publishing any of them. The only way you could get them were online through Scandinavian papers and a few German papers. Because he said, well, I was having fun. We make fun of Christianity, therefore this picture, all the time. Make fun of Jews. Why shouldn't we make fun of Muslims? And his argument was, you know what? A religion is a belief. You have every right to believe whatever you want, but if we want to have fun, we can have fun. You had just had the London bombings. You had Madrid bombings. Look, the Christian Crusades, if they had cartoons, they would have drawn Catholic priests with devil ears on their eyes, or on their heads. But this happened right now. So I'm showing this cartoon of Christ along with the cartoons of Prophet Muhammad as an illustration of expression of freedom that they said, this is what we do. You can like it or not, be offended or not, this is democracy. It went so far as when the newspapers here refused to publish it. That was self-censorship in the United States. Both the Danish and Swedish Prime Minister, as well as the Australian Prime Minister, came out and said, look, this is press freedom. We're not going to tell them what to do. Like it or hate it, that's it, period, and left. Again, this is not an endorsement of one or the other, but it's an expression of something we need to think about. Democracy is the right to express whatever opinion you want, however ludicrous, however inflammatory, however insensitive, in whatever context you want, as long as you don't threaten someone. You have a right to be a racist pig in the United States. That's your right. But you don't have any right to threaten anyone because of it. And you have every right and expectation to be countered when you have such a view. It's when we try to stop any such opinions that you have what history has shown many, many times, real problems emerging when you try to ban something. Germany has banned Nazism. It's the only democracy in the world where fascism is banned. Given their history, most people would say maybe it's understandable. Has it vanished? Has it vanquished Nazis? No. Has it done away with fascism? No. Has it created a huge black market for it? Yes. Even Israel hasn't banned fascism. They even have members of their own national parliament whose sole purpose is to abolish the state of Israel. They're sitting in the Israeli parliament. Now, if that isn't a state of democracy, it's difficult to really, write a better definition. Upcoming in European parliaments are parties all across Europe running on one platform of abolishing the very body that they're being elected to. That's democracy. But we tend to, if we step back, tend to have certain specific things that we associate with democracy, and without which you really can't say that you have a system of democracy. And it's not just going to elections, because if it was only elections, about 3/4 of the world's countries would be democracies, and they're not. Elections does not a democracy make. They're part of it, but it's not all. And if that was all, we would flunk the test. Voting irregularities, different election laws, depending on where you live, and very, very, very low turnout. So there are a whole host of other things that make a system democratic. Just recently, a country in Europe, which you will see when you watch a video on healthcare reform, that prides itself on being a country of people of exceptional nature, that prides themselves on being truly unique in the true sense of the word, that prides themselves on being the ultimate capitalists. And no, we're not talking about America. We're talking about Switzerland. And they have many, many direct votes, plebiscites, referendum, every year. Very easy when you have an issue to say, we're going to take it directly to the people. We're going to directly ask people, what do you want? Do you allow certain church buildings to be built? That was put to referendum a few years ago. Should kids be allowed to commit suicide with a parental consent? It's going to be on the ballot next year. Should you be have the right to commit suicide when you want to? It's voted on before. Etc., etc. Should we join the United Nations? By the way, that was voted down. So they just had a direct vote and asked, should we limit immigration? They have free flow of people in and out from the rest of the European countries, just like every country member in the European Union. You can move between France and Germany like you can between Delaware and New Jersey. People with an EU citizenship can take up a job tomorrow in any country in Europe. Literally, any country, anywhere. And so the Swiss said they have a very simple rule. You get a majority, I don't care if it's by one vote, literally by one vote, of people, and a majority of our states, which they call cantons. Pass. Doesn't matter how few people turn out. So they just had a vote where 50.2% against 49.8% said, yes, we want to limit immigration. And that's what's going to happen. Now, that's a very, very different type of system around the country, where you can have direct votes on everything. We don't have national referendums in the United States. We have them in the States. Yes, sir?
Definition of democracy,
That's the true definition of direct democracy, yes. Whoever wants to show up and vote shows up. Now, they vote, they have one thing in common with us. Because they vote 4 or 5 times a year on these national issues. They have usually a voter turnout about 50%. So it's low. But they have the right to vote on everything, aside from foreign policy and defense. And even there are provisions by which you can vote on. And that they've kept that. Now, if you lived in California, as I said, you'd be pretty used to this in the U.S. You go to vote a couple times a year for various initiatives in the state. Californians just voted to raise their own taxes last year. That's fairly unusual in the United States, but they did. But those are all representations of type of direct democracy that's impossible to have in most countries. You can't run countries by plebiscite. You have to have someone who governs for you. And democracies, as we will see, can have very different types of internal systems. We're talking about the general nature of democracy here in your readings, talk about the general nature of democracies. After we look at the United States system, we'll look at a few other systems, and you'll see that there are no two democracies in the world today. There are no two what you would all recognize as democracies, Australia, Canada, Western Europe, North America, etc., that have exactly the same institutions. None. Some are 2 chambers, 1 chamber, president, prime minister, some are both, etc. But what they all have in common is the fundamental principles that your papers talk about. Functioning civil society, free press, free and fair elections, transparency, freedom of speech guaranteed. Doesn't matter how many parties you have. Doesn't matter how many bodies in the national legislature you have. Doesn't matter whether you're federal or unitary. Those things have to exist. The other depend upon your history and what you prefer. You have to have some way of governing. And you have to have some way of representing those who elect you and to be elected by those by general citizens. You have to have a public realm. In other words, that's what we call civil society or public discussions. That's where you have the choice whether you want to be involved or not. You have the choice as a citizen in democracy to be ignorant. In North Korea and Belarus, you have no choice. If you're stopped on the street and you don't know the name of the government and what you're supposed to do, chances are you and your family will be killed. Period. Now, in democracy, you have every right to be ignorant. You have every right to think that Canada is down by the South Pole, or that all the oil we consume is in the U.S., or that we have no federal government. But in the public realm are where discussions, if you want to join, take place. That's where we have things like think tanks, public meetings, town hall meetings, non-governmental groups, lobbying groups. And it's also where government acts. The roads you drive on, the property you're on here, that's all publicly owned. That means at some point, citizens have a right to question their government, whether at the local, or state, or national in the U.S. What are you doing with that? Should we privatize this or keep it public? Should we pay more for it or should we abandon it? That's what happens in the public realm. Also in the public realm means that when you are in public, the notion of privacy is very, very limited. In other words, today, because of advances in technology, but the principle stands the same as it did 200 years ago, when you're here, or you're walking out on the quad, or you're driving on a public road, the notion of your privacy is very, very, very different than if you're sitting on a property that you bought or that you rent. In other words, you can be photographed, you can be questioned, you can be looked at, etc. And increasingly, if you're in New York, Boston, or if you visited London, you are on camera from the second you step outside of your house, anywhere you go. That's part of life. And we have accepted it. Because if we did not accept it, people would have voted out those who proposed it or would have staged opposition to it. But however much people may protest, most people have accepted closed-circuit TVs. In other words, wherever you are on camera. Not just in this classroom, but anywhere in public life. Less so in the United States still than in many other countries, but in New York, Boston, most places, increasingly in Washington, that you are. In the public realm. It means that you're a citizen, not a subject. Non-democracies have subjects. You do what you are told, not what you want to do. As citizens, you have the right to change government, as we've done. You have the right to throw people out of office, as we have done. You have the right to investigate, bring to attention, go to the media. You have the right to form groups, interest groups, or lobby for something that you care about. You have the right to collective bargaining in various ways, not just through labor unions, but for something you want. You have the right to form groups. You have the right to express yourself. In non-democracies, we'll look at later, you don't. You're a subject. You're no more than a piece of flesh and blood that served the state's interest, or the authoritarian or dictatorial leader's interest. And as citizens, you have both obligations and responsibilities. You have both privileges and obligations. Yes, you have legal guarantees of freedom in the United States, mostly the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. You have certain rights as citizens. But you also have obligations. You have a responsibility to make society work. Our democracy, if 30 million people in the United States said, I don't want this, we don't want it, we're all united, we're going to change the nature of government, there would not be enough police, military, or other forces to stop us, period. The only reason democracies work is because citizens agree to let it work. That's where that social contract comes in that Rousseau spoke of and I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. We let society work. If you want to change it, change it. We changed the nature of our laws many, many times in the United States. One of the few countries that haven't rewritten our Constitution, many other countries have, because people's preferences change. And that's a hallmark of citizenship, that you have the responsibilities to make sure the society actually works. And many of the things that you think about in the United States are not laws. We don't have a law of language, somehow it works. We don't have federal laws of alcohol, but somehow it's, states have colluded or joined together or all agreed that this is what we're going to do. We've changed a whole host of laws when it comes to individual rights over the years, through court challenges, through protests, through electing new people. Yet, if enough people think that our society isn't working and the government's system isn't working, we have the right to overthrow it. That's your right. Not by military means, but through legal means. There are ways in which to do so. And we compete for ideas. That's what I started with. You compete for ideas over what's right and wrong. This goes back again to what we sometimes either get so angry about, because you think, how can people think like that? How can people have those opinions? On the other hand, the only way that we can actually get change is that people have different opinions and people say, I don't like this anymore. I think this is wrong. That's how we overcame segregation. That's how we overcame Vietnam War. That's how we developed a whole new acceptance of freedom of everything from sex and alcohol on TV to what people generally accept that government should pay for. Government didn't just explode at the federal level on its own. People asked for different programs. People asked for the collective to do more. And it's not an easy thing, because what some people think is really good, we should all pay for education, we should all pay for roads. Others think, no. If you drive and I don't drive, you should pay for it. Education is a commodity like anything else. Privatize it all. These are different ideas of what should or should not be done, but you should be able to compete on those ideas, and that's why democracy is so difficult. That's why gridlock at times tend to dominate, not just here, but in many other places as well. It's not easy to get people to agree. Not when they look out and they say and have very, very different ideas of what should be done and how it should be done. The fact that you can fight a fight and lose, and not lose your right to fight again. The fact that you can have an idea that loses out. The fact that you can have, in 74, to take one of the more controversial issues in the United States compared to most other countries, abortion rights. In 74, it seemed those who advocated for the right to women to choose had prevailed. That hasn't stopped those who lost that fight for continuing that fight. And there are legal guarantees to do so. Those who opposed the income tax hike under Bill Clinton didn't just sit down and say, okay, we've lost forever. You have the legal right and the means available to you to fight the next fight. You lose an election, you lose a vote, you lose an argument, you can continue the next time. And you have legal rights to do so. You're not squashed, you're not banned just because your idea doesn't win out. So I hope you think we're not talking about racial or ethnic groups here. We're talking about ideas, proposals. Obviously, the minority rights when it comes to ethnicity, race, religion are also legally guaranteed in democracies where institutionalized discrimination based upon things like race, ethnicity, gender, religion are banned. So you have the guarantee to be able to fight again. You have the guarantee to be able to get your opinions heard again. That's the legal majority rule, minority rights. The ethnic, racial, gender, and religious and sexual orientation mix is a legal right that applies to all. So it has nothing to do with the minority-majority views at any given time. And the fact that you have a functioning society of organizations and press. There is no democracy without a free press. You're all going to go out and have different jobs. Some of you may become researchers. Some postal service employers, some biologists, some doctors, engineers, accountants, whatever. Not everyone has the time just to investigate what the public servants and public employees do. That's the role of the press. The role of the press is to investigate, agitate, poke. Not just report, but to actually investigate. And we should be thankful in a democracy. You may not like what they find. You may not like certain types of news organizations. You may think some are just out for political points to disrespect a particular ideological view. Conservative media against a liberal or left-leaning incumbent, and vice versa. But that's part of democracy. It's part of the right to find out. It's a right to dig. It's a right to expose. And without it, democracy doesn't exist. And all of you, all of us in this room are socialized into it. Now, there may be people who have come from other countries, who've grown up in systems where there were certain things they couldn't do. And we're not talking about where you can't play and so on. But certain things you couldn't say, certain things you couldn't utter, certain behavior you couldn't criticize. And you were socialized into a different way of behaving. If you know that your life depends upon behaving a certain way, you pretty rapidly adapt to that. But we're socialized into a system where you have every right to not care, to not bother, to be ignorant, but also to a lot of norms that you don't really think about. You're socialized in the fact that we have sports fanatics all across the country in a way that you may not think about, but it's very, very different than anywhere else. Sport here is pure entertainment, but you have fans going like crazy. There is actually no competition in professional sports. I can get that into that later. But it's sheer entertainment that is fascinating for all of society. The fact that you go all throughout the South and all the gentlemen stand and hold doors for the ladies. It's something you're socialized into. We think we invented apple pie. Hint, hint, we didn't. But it's part of society. And you're socialized into it. And it's very effective because you don't know it. And we all are. By our family, first of all. By your friends. By this group here, which is one of the most influential socializing agents that you'll ever have. Your college peers. Last 4 years of high school and college has so much effect on what you think is acceptable, what you think is right or wrong, how you behave. Yet people don't think about it, and that's the whole point. It takes someone outside to point out, see how you change, see how you modify yourself. You go through stages. You don't want to stand out. You want to be liked by everyone. You don't want to be the oddball out. And then the flip side happens about the junior or senior year in college. Of course, these are generalizations to make a point about socialization. But people and groups around you affect how you think about society, what you think is acceptable, what you agree or disagree with. Your parents are immensely influential in many times. It's not uncommon for people to get to their early stages of adulthood and think, yeah, I'm a Democrat because my parents have always been, or I'm a Republican because my parents have always been, or government is a big bloated bureaucracy that does nothing good for me at all because my parents have always complained about it. And it's part of life growing up. It's not a right or wrong. Socialization happens in a very different way. If you were raised in Japan or South Korea, you would be expected to spend 45 hours a week studying, including Saturdays. You would be expected to study 11 and a half months a year. And you would be expected to be incredibly shameful if you didn't get into college. And you would be expected to be very respectful of your elders. That's just socialization. It's a different society. But it forms how society works and how society functions. Some create good mathematicians. Some create very low crime rate. Some create innovation and creativity. But it's part of the socialization process. And it also leads to different types of interest groups or political parties. The fact that you have so many different groups in a country like the United States, so many vastly different ideas, is also a function of the way you're socialized. There's no one uniform American cultural system. If you're raised in rural Kansas or in urban Seattle, chances are you're raised very differently. But it all somehow comes together, and it creates a type of dynamism and creativity that is perhaps different than in other democracies. So again, democracies can be different internally. They can have different institutions, different norms, different cultures, different societies, but the principles of free speech, freedom of expression, free press, free fair elections still hold. The fact that you can actually see decisions having an impact. Now, Eisenhower, when he first came into office, Dwight Eisenhower, having been a general and led the United States in World War II, as a military personnel, and some of you in the room may relate to this, in the military it's very important that orders are followed strictly through the hierarchy because people's lives depend upon it, and it's a very, very, very hierarchical system for a whole host of reasons. And he was constantly frustrated because he would give orders from the White House and express preferences of what he wanted to happen. And then the outside, in the end, through the bureaucratic pipeline, whether through Congress or his own bureaucracy, came something very different. Say, why is it that I can say one thing here and something else happens at the end? Because people have different ideas of how to interpret what he says or what he wants along the way. Where you sit is where you stand, as the saying goes. If he issues an executive order that I know may eliminate my job, I'm going to interpret that order to the best I can to help save my job. On the other hand, when the people in referendum say, we want to stop immigration, like in Switzerland, or in California, we want our income tax to go up as long as it's ring-fenced for schools. And it happens, and it actually occurs, that's very different. Or when George Washington, first president, stepped down voluntarily after 2 elections, not because we find that surprising, because there were elections, but the British press were all over it, saying, why in the world will a popular leader step down voluntarily? Entitlements. Why didn't it just stay on? Because decisions, in this case an election, have actual significant impact, repercussions. They actually are carried through. And if you look at elections in Belarus, or North Korea, or Myanmar, or in part of Russia, it doesn't matter. People vote 90-95% for a leader. It's a staged election, fraudulent. There's no competition. Opposition is banned. The latest election in Egypt had a 95% approval rating of the new constitution. And this is a country that's going through a nominal process of democracy. But opposition posters were banned. Opposition leaders were incarcerated. Just disappeared. That's not democracy. It doesn't mean that you're actually asked to decide on anything. It's a foregone conclusion. Pardon me. So decisions actually have an impact. One of the biggest impacts for all of you in here may have been Obamacare. A lot of people opposed it. A lot of people thought it was completely reckless. A lot of people loved it. The fact is, whether you liked it or not, it passed through the process that we have set up in the United States. And while there are ways in which those who oppose it can still file legal challenges and try to obstruct it, the decision, however unpopular, was accepted. It was accepted as a democratically passed piece of legislation, and it has direct impact on society. Not because someone is pointing a gun at your head, but because it's the written law. And that is very, very different than in countries that don't have democracy. And it represents how we want to spend our resources. Now, I was listening to a couple of European newscasts the other day. And for those of you who speak a second language or a third, if you listen to newscasts outside the United States, you're not surprised to hear profanities at times thrown in interviews or other references that we find completely banned here. And that's acceptable. It's just part of society. Nobody cares. If you go up to Canada, they have a federal system like us, but everyone pays health care through taxes. And they've accepted it. They've accepted it through legislative decisions. And it's a distribution of resources and values that they accept. And we haven't. So democratic systems, democratic decisions have direct impact, direct effect on how we govern society. Then when our Supreme Court ruled that the ban on carrying a weapon within 150 meters of a school is not constitutional, the laws were removed. And so the impact of democracy is worth stepping back and thinking about, because it means that even unpopular decision for a lot of people that some people support and that have been accepted in a legitimate legal way actually happen. They actually occur. And that's the hallmark of democracy that is sometimes so difficult because we tend to forget about that. Now, the process by which we perhaps express democracy the least in the United States, because we have such low voter turnout, are elections. But of course, they form a fundamental part of democracy. You have to be able to stand for elections and vote freely. That doesn't mean that everyone should have the right to vote, regardless of age and so on. But the limitations set have to apply to everyone and not include immutable characteristics. In other words, the restrictions can't be based on things you can't change, like gender or race or ethnicity or age. Well, age can be restricted, sorry, of course. But even there, some countries allow 16-year-olds, some countries allow 14-year-olds. In the Senate in Italy, it's only 20. You have to be 25. But it applies to everyone. But elections are just part of it. Elections have to be free, transparent, open, regular. You have to be able to compete. There has to be a process by which anyone who wants can actually get in, either as a candidate or to vote, as long as the restrictions apply to everyone and you meet those qualifications. But it's only part of it. Because imagine if we had elections in the United States, but we had no free media, we had no civil groups, civil society groups, non-governmental groups, no interest groups, no lobbying. It would be pointless. We would be communist Soviet Union. That's what we would be. They had a gloriously written constitution. If you go back and read the constitution of the Soviet Union, you would think it would be the democratic paradise on earth. But, of course, none of it was implemented ever. It's pointless. Their elections had a 95% turnout, and the communists were elected by 99% of the population. Appears to be very strong support, right? The result staged. There was no competition, predetermined outcome. So elections alone do not a democracy make. If you stifle information and counterpoints, like in Egypt, that's not a democratic election. That's, again, where the media and the freedom of press and the freedom of association comes in. You can't just have one candidate. Now, if people voluntarily do not run, in some members of the state legislature in Pennsylvania and other states, or at a local level, people may run unopposed because nobody else wants to. But there are processes by which you can easily get on the ballot. It's very different than being banned from doing so. Some of you may choose to stand for local office or state office times to come. And again, there are students from ESU who have done so many times while they've been students and thereafter. There are at least 3 current students serving on different local boards and elected offices as we speak, I know. Yes?
Say, like in Egypt, is there benefits that they want to call themselves a democracy when they're not, and everyone really knows that it's not, that the elections aren't open, that people are suppressed, and, you know, like,
Yes. Yes.
Why are they calling it something that it's not when it's obvious that it's not?
There are no universal definitions of what democracy is. There's no universal definition of human rights. None. There are no universal definitions of individual rights or choice, anything to that. There's no universal definition of terrorism. People have different cultures, different societies have different ideas. There's some that are prevailing, more common. And then there are those who have won out by most areas and most regions, like the basic definitions of democracy. We'll see that next time, that when you transition from having very authoritarian or a complete totalitarian rule, where you're not allowed to say anything, where you're not allowed to express your opinions, where there are no alternatives, where you can be incarcerated or worse simply for expressing your opinion, like North Korea. Egypt was a very authoritarian regime for 40 years. We propped up the military, we paid the military, because we prefer to have a stable but authoritarian Egypt as a neighbor to Israel than having an unruly democracy where we didn't know where it went. When countries go from having that very authoritarian hardline rule over to this pluralistic, open society where people have the right to express their opinion and groups clash, it's a very, very... Remember, we were no democratic paradise, neither in 1776, nor in 1787, nor in 1850. It took us about another 150 years before we actually had equality in society, right? And so when it's a very difficult process going from allowing nothing to all. Now, there are countries that have done it faster and then countries that have done it slower, which we'll see next time. But there are always the potential that you slip when you do that. Because people get angry when others disagree with them. And if you've been accustomed to having, say that you've worked for the government or your party has dominated in this authoritarian rule, and all of a sudden you have to compete with someone else and ideas come up and other groups want you out, you get angry. You lose your privileges, you lose your perks, you lose your power. And it's a very difficult transition. Tunisia's new prime minister said something very, very... It's the most successful of Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, and Egypt, the uprisings in the last 4 years, said, we had the choice between power and democracy, because we're the biggest party. It was the Islamic dominated party that formed after Tunisia's revolution started in 2011. And he said, I chose democracy and stepped down. And that's a very, very rare occasion. But it has enabled them to adopt a new constitution. It enabled them to stay out of civil strife. It has enabled them to stay away from military clamping down on civilians. Now, in Egypt, there were free and fair elections a few years ago. But a party that was banned, called the Muslim Brotherhood, won an overwhelming majority and installed the president. And then the president issued a bunch of decrees that millions of people thought were unfair because they banned certain types of opposition ideas. They imposed certain restrictions on women again. And so even though the election was free and fair, people protested endlessly in the streets. Then the military stepped in, removed the president. A caretaker government was put in place in an undemocratic way, even if the aims were democratic, but it was an undemocratic process. And then rejected the old constitution, dissolved parliament, and held a new election. And now this new popular uprising that had democratic aims came to power, and they in turn banned the opposition from running ideas when the constitutional referendum was held. So you had 95% approval. So both sides did something that was very undemocratic in the name of democracy, of transparency. Banned the opposition forces, clamped down on the opposition ideas. I have very different ideas of what's thing, and your radical group should not be included at all. You should be banned. And then they come to power and say, your liberal-minded Western puppet ideas should not be accepted here. You should be banned. And this is not a Lilliputian country. This is 40 million people at the heart of the most volatile region of on the globe. So this is of huge interest. If Egypt fundamentally makes it through, Brazil took 20 years. They had dictatorship, transition to democracy, authoritarian military rule, transition to democracy, military rule, and then finally made it. This is not an easy process. And we tend to forget that because ours was, our fundamental wars and civil strifes and so on were so long ago. free and fair elections make up a fundamental part of democracies. But all of these other things have nothing to do with the elections. But as I said, they have to be present. We mentioned the free press. Without it, you don't have a democracy. Civil liberties, to be able to associate with any group you want. Associational autonomy. You have the right to set up any group you want, any interest group you want, as long as you're not threatening someone else. And you can advocate for change. The fact that we set criteria for inclusion either in elections or running for office, etc., that apply to everyone, irrespective of immutable characteristics. The fact that you actually want society to work. Remember, we had a civil war where enough people said, we don't like this, we're going to change it. Or we're going to become two countries. And we've had mass protests and uprisings over various issues since. It's your right to question whether or not you like society or whether you want change. That's a hallmark of democracy in the U.S. We've seen that many, many times before. And you have a responsibility that goes in all of these areas. You have a responsibility to maintain society, to maintain a democracy. Democracy is not something imposed. You cannot impose free press, free expression, free will, and a functioning society. We can't express what we have impose what we have in this room. You're free to leave if you want, free to come if you want. You're free to take a course here or elsewhere. You're free to embark upon a career of your choice. You're free to go blog about what an idiot I am. That's your choice. But it is also responsibility of society, of its citizens, to actually see that it works. Because if nobody worked, if nobody paid taxes, if everyone decided that I'm just going to go have fun all day, nothing would work. There would be no, some magic government coming down and making things happen. It's us. And if 10% of taxpayers said income tax is too high, we're simply not going to pay it, it would lead to a very different system. Because democracy cannot be enforced through military or police force. Individual instances, yes. If someone steals a property that doesn't belong to them, a car, clothing, yes, we have laws that have been implemented, that have been written and then enforced by people that we have given authority to do so. But those are individual cases or small group cases, but not for entire society. That's where your responsibility as citizens come in. If you really want to change something, there has to be enough people who want to do so. Whining and griping is one thing. But organizing people to actually impose change. As we did it with segregation, or we did with the Vietnam War, or we did with income taxes. Income taxes were 90% in the 50s, the highest bracket. So you paid 90 cents on the dollar if you were in the top 10% in the United States, or top 5%. We changed that. There was conscription during the draft during the Vietnam War. We don't have that. So we can change things, but it's your responsibility to make sure that this social contract is upheld. Thomas Jefferson said you have every right to change this. That's your responsibility as citizens. But not militarily, not violently, but use the laws that are on the books, and you can change the society. There's no written rule that we have to stay the same. There are things you don't change, you can change it. But you have to follow the defined laws and rules on the books for how to do so. And this is absolutely essential. We just mentioned in Egypt how the military stepped in, overthrew an elected government. Turkey has done this 4 times. They've been a nominal democracy since 1963. close ally of the United States because of its strategic position. We've had them as an alliance partner, a written alliance partner for 50 years, provided them billions upon billions of dollars in military aid. 4 times their military has stepped in and overthrown a democratically, fairly elected government because they didn't like them. And again, I said they incarcerate journalists more per person than anywhere else in the world. Now, the basis for all these laws, of course, and the functioning of laws and the implementation of decisions where decisions actually have an effect. How many of you have federally insured student loans? I'm not asking the amounts. Okay, let me ask you this. Only 5% of the American population now have private student loans. So if you have student loans, the probability that you have a federally insured student loan is very, very high. Say, so most of you have student loans. Okay. You know that Congress actually votes on what interest you are to pay, which comes out of your account or your parents' account or whoever's paying for it. They vote on that every year. Last spring, half of Congress wanted to let it float, which would have meant for most of you a 3 percentage point increase. So if you had $10,000 a loan, it would be $300 more a year. And others wanted to keep it at 3.85. Now that's a decision that directly affects each and every one with a student loan in their pocketbook immediately. That's a decision that has real-life repercussions. Now we kept it at the old lower interest rate. And that's going to come back up again. But the Constitution is a basis for those ordinary laws, the foundation. We have the oldest non-altered Constitution. We've amended it, but we have the fundamental Constitution has not been altered, the oldest functioning in the world. Now the British goes back to the 12th century, the Swedish to the 15th century, but they've modified theirs. But we had 48 countries after World War II. Today we have 200. They've all written constitutions since then. And when you write constitutions, now most of you are too old, young to remember. Did anyone ever watch The West Wing? Okay, sir. Did you see that episode where they were actually helping New Country write their constitution? There are a couple of episodes in there where they deal with a fictitious transition government. They took real life stories and then changed the name, sort of like Law and Order, but take real events and change the names and places. And they were helping to write the Constitution. So they had university law professors, they had judges, they had public administration experts. This happens all the time. 6 constitutions on average are rewritten every year around the world. And it's not like a bunch of people get together and say, hey, I have an idea about a constitution. Let's write this in. It's a difficult process because you're not writing something for you. You're writing something for the next generation and the next generation. Anyone heard of John Rawls, an American philosopher? Oh, yes, sir. Well, one of those things when it came to writing public policy, he explained that it's difficult because you're immersed in it. And you can't be objective if you're immersed in something, however much you try, because you know that what you write may affect you in one way or another. So he drew up this theoretical example to try to get around this veil of ignorance. Say that you're not born, or you're in your mother's womb, and you have no idea whether you will be a high school janitor in southern Kansas. This was not his example, but I'll give you, making $20,000 a year, or you'll be a Wall Street billionaire, making $200 billion a year. You have no idea which one you'll end up being, and you have to write a tax system that you think is fair, whether you end up in the first or the second position. Now, go ahead. The point is, it's not very easy when you're writing something for something that you do not know, your kids, your future, the next generation, people come, something that is both workable, flexible, and enforceable. And by all accounts, our forefathers did a darn good job in doing so. Regardless of what you think of the actual Constitution, the fact that it as a document has been unaltered for that long, aside from a few amendments, is a pretty impressive feat, given how different society is today compared to what it was in the 18th century. But when you write new constitutions, it's sort of like a smorgasbord, and Americans love buffets, but substitute the words choose what you like instead of all you can eat, okay? And that's really, if you think of buffet that way, it's the ultimate way to go to a restaurant, because if you have vegetarians or vegans or those with allergies, they can choose what they like and prefer and can eat. And writing a constitution is a bit the same way. When the Czech and Slovak Republic split in 1993, one of the few instances in the world where a country split into peacefully, completely peacefully, agreed on both sides, the Czechoslovakia under the communist rule, and they decided to become the Slovak Republic and the Czech Republic. They had to write a new constitution in both places. And they wrote very different constitutions. They set up different institutions, different structures. But they looked, say, what's our history like? What do our people want? How is our country divided? Do we want a president and a prime minister? Do we want two chambers or one chamber? Do we want proportional representation, or do we want first around the poll? You write constitutions. Do we want them to be really narrow? Do we want them to be broad? Do we want them to be specific? Or do we want them to be general? And that's how constitutions are written. You have to look at your country's history, your people, your preferences. There are hundreds of Americans who over the years have helped other countries write constitutions. Along with the Europeans, we literally wrote Kosovo's constitution years ago. One of the most recent independent countries in Southeastern Europe. And we had to take into account their ethnic makeup, their geography, and what they wanted historically. So democracies are very, very difficult to govern. And you have a couple of different types of things that you also need to think about, honestly. We have the symbolic version. Those are the elections, the appearance of transparency, the appearance of involvement, the fact that you can say whatever you want. You have to have the appearance and the symbols of democracy, of equality. As I said, Soviet Union had a wonderful constitution. They had general elections. They had different professions. Symbols of democracy. But there was no substantive democracy. We have all of the symbols of democracy. But many people question whether we actually have problems with the procedural, the substantive part of democracy. Because people are apathetic in elections. Fewer young are joining interest groups. Knowledge about public affairs is actually no better today than it was 20 years ago. Look at foreign policy, it's arguably worse. So, an informed citizenry is essential for democracy, and we have some problems there. So it's not enough just to have the symbols of democracy, the elections, the press, the right to organize, the right to freedom, but you should actually have substance as well. And for substance, you need procedures. We need to decide who's going to participate, how should each vote be counted, what do you need, how many votes are needed. And there are legitimate, transparent, democratic ways of deciding on how to do that. We have a constitution that says certain things are required, but then you can modify others. The voting age, or even what we vote for. States used to appoint their senators. Today, they're elected. That's a change in the procedure that we agreed upon in the United States. We used to have a higher voting age. We lowered that. It's a procedure we changed. We used to have, particularly in the South, institutionalized and accepted in many states in the South, legal restrictions on certain ethnic and racial groups from voting or for holding office. We changed that. So the procedure of democracy, it has to be able to function and work and modify it and change over time, and to have clear and accepted rules for participation and equality. And we think sometimes that, as we've said before, and many of you have correctly pointed out, that voting is a form of direct democracy. We don't vote for the president, as we have correctly pointed out. We vote for people, then cast a ballot for president. And one person, one vote does not apply in the presidential election. It does in the senatorial, it does in your congressional district, it does locally, absolutely. It does in your voting in a referendum in California or another state, absolutely. But we've accepted that in certain instances, one person, one vote does not apply. In smaller societies or locally, you can actually have direct elections. You can think about, most probably in your lifetime, process by which you have an app on your smartphone by which you vote. Why not? There are countries already where not only do you vote electronically, you get your mail electronically, you file your taxes on your phone, you contact your local, but basically where you do everything electronically, including sign off and on legal documents and so on. 17 countries in the world already that have electronic signatures that are valid the same way a physical signature is. So we could contemplate a system where in 20 years, if you're sitting in a classroom like this, or 10 years, and it was election day, I would say, okay, take 5 minutes out of class time and vote. Why not? Direct democracy is easier. We just mentioned Switzerland, California. Town hall meetings up in New Hampshire mostly New Hampshire, is very commonplace. But we have an indirect representative system. And that's the norm today in democracy. We elect people who vote, who then represent us. You elect legislators. You elect the head of government. You elect people who then take decisions on your behalf, and there are procedures by which you can either recall them or vote them out of office, or in other ways remove them. And the way in which they're held accountable, public public accountability, elections, as some people like to say, we have term limits already. They're called elections, and if people choose not to use them, that means that they don't work. But that's people's choice. But government officials at every level have to be held accountable, and they do so through civil society, through non-governmental organizations, through free press, through groupings of people that in different ways hold them accountable, challenge them, question them. So that is an absolute essential part of democracy. When people choose not to employ the substantive part of democracy, it doesn't matter how much of the symbolic we have. Because regardless of what your chosen profession will be, you're all part of a society. And whether you live here or move to another country, most of you are going to live in democracies of one form or another, and the only way that they are sustained, the only way they can maintain themselves is that people are involved. And the only way we can guarantee that people stay involved is that people are informed. What are your rights? What are your responsibilities? You have the right ignorant, but if enough people are ignorant, uninvolved, and uninformed, the system that we like will collapse. It's the ultimate test of a collective action problem. Democracy cannot function without involved citizens. A democracy without involved citizens becomes authoritarian. It allows the very clique who are informed, well-positioned, and in power to run amok. That's what happens when enough people say, I don't care anymore. And the only reason why democracies continue to function in the United States is because enough people said, this is something wrong with it, we get involved, we want to change something. And we've seen that numerous times throughout our history. Okay, thanks.